Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this conference. And as someone who's just starting out, it's genuinely an honor to be included in a conference with all of you esteemed experts with years or decades of experience in your respective fields. I just wanted to say that, and also thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. Again, just starting out, so I really appreciate that. Um, to listen to my presentation today, which I think is kind of timely considering some really recent news. And I'm going to try and share my slide here. Okay. Yeah, so just yesterday, actually, I read that President Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu will soon be reconvening the same working group that was established during the days of the Obama administration for the purpose of discussing the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, as we call it. And after this working group was established, of course, Obama and Netanyahu had vastly different opinions on the Iran nuclear deal, but in the end, it was passed. And then just 3 years later, Trump, who agreed with the Israeli prime minister, withdrew the US from the deal. And now President Biden is starting discussions to re-enter the deal, which Netanyahu strongly opposes. So, this is a controversial topic, and today I'm not advocating one way or the other, and I'm not discussing the Iran nuclear deal. However, regardless of your position on this issue, it is clear that the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA has caused tensions between Iran, the IAEA, and other signing nations to really rise in recent years. And Iran has hinted that it may continue to develop uranium enrichment capabilities despite the agreement. So it's issues like these that have raised this question. If negotiations or IAEA inspections fail, what might nuclear war look like in the Middle East? And my objective with this presentation is to take a new look at the current IAEA inspection criteria to avoid a result like this and show how it may be time to reevaluate the nuclear material safeguard standards, given the damage that, just like Henry was saying, a low yield, only 1 kiloton nuclear weapon could do in the Middle East today, which could be a real outcome given the tensions, given Israel's dislike of the Iran deal, could worst case scenario. So here's some questions that I'm going to answer in my brief. To prevent another Hiroshima or Nagasaki, are the IAEA standards strict enough? How much uranium or plutonium do you actually need to build a bomb that could cause these levels of casualties? And what are the casualties and effects, by the way, of a really small nuclear weapon in today's technological capabilities? And what are some policy implications of these observations? So many of you might already know this, but just to review the numbers and some definitions, an IAEA defines a significant quantity of nuclear material just as the amount of uranium or plutonium that any entity could produce a nuclear weapon using this amount of material. And they define it as 25 kilograms highly enriched uranium, 8 kilograms plutonium, just to keep the numbers in your mind for the rest of the presentation. And also some other numbers that I'm going to refer to later and to just keep in the back of your mind. The attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki resulted in about 100,000 deaths each. And this is deaths that occurred within just a few months following the detonation, not including cancers later on, just within a few months. So with those numbers behind us and in our mind, how much uranium and plutonium, by the way, is actually needed to build a nuclear weapon? Well, Dr. Cochran, actually, who just presented before me, and some of his colleagues at the NRDC did a really interesting and useful report a few years ago, or maybe quite a few years ago. I don't remember when actually, but did an interesting report showing that maybe the actual amount of nuclear material required to build, or we know actually that the amount of nuclear material required is much lower than an IAEA significant quantity. And here I pointed out the yield of the Nagasaki weapon, 20 kilotons. It takes about 6 kilograms of plutonium to, with a low technical capability weapon, to actually achieve that yield. And that's lower than 8 kilograms, the IAEA significant quantity, and 16 less than 25 when it comes to uranium. And so it looks like the IAEA was determining their significant quantities based on some kind of World War II era weapon. And this is 20 kilotons. And this raises the question, like Henry had just mentioned, which is the question he actually commissioned this research for me to try and quantify, is, well, what damage can be done with the least amount of nuclear material? So if someone were to just barely acquire 3 kilograms or 8 kilograms of uranium or 3 kilograms of plutonium, this top row in the table, what, and they were able to build a 1 kiloton weapon or 2 kilotons or something small, what are the effects of a 1 kiloton surface burst weapon, and particularly looking at the Middle East given recent news? So, for this research project, which is still ongoing, actually, I'm going to be looking at 5 cities in the Middle East, and these 5 cities, but it's still a work in progress. And so today I'm just going to be talking about Tehran, which is the first city that I'm looking at. Uh, so the first question I had to ask, and just to briefly go over my research process, was how do you actually simulate nuclear weapons detonation? Well, I looked at, there's a lot of different software you can try to acquire that were produced at national laboratories or by the government. And some of those software you used to be able to acquire, but it turns out that nowadays many of those software have become classified. So I had to do some interviews with Dr. Cochran and some of his colleagues and other experts, some of my colleagues at MIT as well, and ask them about methodologies and what can I do to develop my own methodology. And here are just some of the tools and codes and sources of data that I used, population data, etc., to be able to calculate and develop my simulation. What about the results? So using Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories hotspot code, which you can download and mess around with, by the way, this is just a quick visual of, in the city of Tehran, what is the actual extent of a low yield weapon? And it's about 15 miles across the whole city and 2 kilometers or so diameter of the prompt effects of the weapon. And this is just to give a visual so you can get an understanding of how far the effects of the weapon will reach in the immediate moment. But what numbers does this actually translate to? How many people will actually be affected? And this is the really important result. This is where we get to the meat of the results. So remembering that the deaths due to Hiroshima and Nagasaki are around 100,000, the really important point here is looking at deaths due to initial radiation, the second line on my slide. It looks like Hotspot is telling me that the deaths of just a 1 kiloton surface level weapon will acquire about the same numbers. But remember that Hiroshima and Nagasaki weapons are 15 to 20 kilotons, so 15 to 20 times the energy and much more material. But we're already acquiring about the same number of deaths due to 1 kiloton weapon. And as for the blast effects, this is the shock wave, the pressure wave due to the explosion. Right now, my hotspot is giving me about 2,600 deaths, but actually I discussed the results with some of my colleagues and other experts who have more experience than me doing such calculations. And it may be that the hotspot may not be taking into account uh, detailed enough details about the shockwave, and it may be a too crude calculation. And in fact, the blast casualties, the deaths due to the blast may actually be much higher, I expect, after I revise the calculation and look at some other tools that are out there. And that's forthcoming in my final report, which will maybe be available on the NPEC website later this year or something like that. And so next we had to ask, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the plans are for the report, but something like that. Um, so next, we must wonder about the nuclear fallout. This is a really unique, obviously unique to nuclear weapons situation. And before I zoom in on that little map that I showed on the previous slide, just to give you an idea of what are some health effects due to different radiation dose levels. There's a lot of numbers here, but the important things that I want to point out are the number of people that will be affected by each level here. So, according to my simulation, millions of people will be affected by a dose level that is unacceptably high to some degree, millions of people. And when it comes to cancer increase over the lifetime, 2 million people will be at risk of a definitive increased risk of cancer. This includes people who acquired 10 to less than 100, so 10 to 99. This yellow, orange, and red, all of those people is 2 million people will be at risk. But the really big important result here is that 2 million people, that number is not on my slide, but 2 million people will be affected by mild radiation sickness. Well, I say mild, but it's actually serious. The effects are serious in the moment of the explosion, and nausea, and that will affect that people, even though they weren't within the immediate blast effect or immediate radiation effect, it will be even more difficult to escape the area, leading to even greater casualties that are really difficult to quantify. But even those 2 million people that are affected by this, terrible sickness that will come over them and painful effects, looking at what we know, it's very difficult to estimate leukemia and cancer deaths after a nuclear explosion. We don't obviously have much data on that, but looking at some very detailed studies, statistical analysis of Hiroshima and Nagasaki effects, it could be possible that as many as 1/3 of these people affected by this radiation will die of leukemia within 10 or even extending out to 30 years. And most of those will be concentrated on the front end, so 10 years. So dramatically shortened lifetime, and that will be possibly as many as 600,000 people. And just here's a quick overview of the city of Tehran so you can understand, again, get just a zoomed out overview of the city. And now here you can see that the fallout will effectively cover the entire city, and no one will be spared from some level of unacceptable radiation. And that's millions of people. So, yeah. Yeah, that's all with this slide. I think I ended up explaining everything on the previous slide. So this just dramatizes the geographical extent of the fallout. So what are some conclusions we can make from all of this? It looks like the current values for the IAEA significant quantities are too low, and they're probably based on World War II nuclear weapon effects, which are kind of outdated. And I have the numbers here on the screen. If you look at a modern 1 kiloton nuclear weapon design, this requires a much smaller amount of nuclear material than an IAEA significant quantity. It could be one third, and with high technical capability, even 1/8 of the IAEA's stated number. And given a highly dense modern urban environment, the casualties due to a low yield, just 1 kiloton nuclear weapon may be equal to or even greater than, I expect, those following the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. And so, looking at all of these results, it may be time to reevaluate IAEA safeguard criteria. Thank you.